Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope you are truly safe and sound. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a set of virtual discussions, at least for the time being, of issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, much to my surprise, and perhaps to the surprise of many of you, or perhaps even to the surprise of our three wonderful panelists, Israel has a new government. The first in 12 years without Benjamin Netanyahu at its head, a so-called change coalition. It's fair to ask, however, what will actually change? Some may argue that the biggest change and the biggest accomplishment of the government has occurred already, the dispatching of Benjamin Netanyahu into the opposition, the longest governing prime minister in Israel's history. But is that all there is? We do have other notable firsts that might represent not just headlines, but maybe even trend lines. The first time an Arab political party is formally signed up as part of a governing coalition, especially notable given the fact that a month ago we witnessed some of the worst communal violence between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs since 2000, and perhaps even since the state was created. We have the first Orthodox prime minister. Anshel referred to him as Dati Light. Maybe that's a better description. The first time since 2015 that there are no Orthodox parties in the coalition, and I lost count, but of Israel's 36 governments, I don't imagine there were more than 4 or 5 that lacked the participation of religious parties. So how significant is this election, the fourth in a little more than 2 years? Can we argue it's transformation or some kind of inflection point, or is it just part and parcel of the transactional sort of tick-tock that we become accustomed to in the often violent, volatile, and crazy world of Israeli politics? Or maybe it's just too early to tell. So many questions. How do we get to this strange and seemingly unwieldy entity? The average length of Israeli governments since independence is just under 2 years. Can this government last, and will it be able to accomplish anything? What is to become of Mr. Netanyahu? Again, to use Anshel's phrase, is he going to become a king in exile? A convicted Israeli prime minister? The comeback kid? Or perhaps he'll depart from public life entirely in search of greener, no pun intended, pastures. And what does the new government mean for the 2 Palestinian challenges that Israel faces? The internal challenge of a national minority and Palestinians in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. Fortunately, and I say this every time, and I'll say it again, I do not have to answer any of these questions today. But we are really fortunate, truly fortunate, to have 3 extraordinary panelists who I believe can. Let me introduce them. Anshel Pfeffer is a senior writer for Haaretz, the Israeli correspondent for The Economist, and the author of Bibi, The Turbulent Life and Times of Benjamin Netanyahu. Natan Sachs is too modest. He's the director of the Brookings Institution Center for Middle East Policy in Washington. He publishes widely on Middle Eastern affairs, Israel's foreign policy, and Israeli domestic politics, and is a frequent media commentator on these issues. So much more I could say about Natan. And finally, Tal Schneider is a political correspondent for the Times of Israel. She was previously the Washington, D.C. correspondent for Ma'ariv Daily and a business political correspondent for Globes, while also running her own political blog, The Plog. She's a frequent commentator on Israeli radio and TV. Schneider is the recipient of the 2015 Ometz Award and the 2012 Google Digital Excellence in Journalism Award. Her stories have appeared in many places, including Haaretz, The Marker, and Ma'ariv. So, with that overly long introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Anshel. The virtual floor is yours.
So, as we're beginning this broadcast, thank you very much for having us, Aaron. It's exactly 24 hours since the unbelievable almost happened. I think the man who believed the least that this moment would arrive was Benjamin Netanyahu himself. And those of us who were watching, whether in the Knesset or live on television, those moments after the confidence vote in the new government passed 60-59, and there was like a last minute bit of a kerfuffle there when it wasn't quite clear whether the vote had even passed. You saw Netanyahu getting up from his seat at the center of the government table at the front of the Knesset plenum, walking around a bit like a caged animal, walking back to his seat, and he sat down, and he was basically no longer prime minister because the new government had been just sworn in, not sworn in, had won the confidence vote. It was about to be sworn in, and then suddenly the by then former Knesset speaker Yariv Levin comes up from behind and taps Netanyahu, his boss, on the shoulder and kind of beckons, get up, get up. And that was the moment Netanyahu suddenly realized this is no longer his seat. 12 years, that was his seat, and he started walking backwards, looking for he didn't even remember where the leader of the opposition seat is. He never really noticed it never really registered for him in the last 12 years where the leader of the opposition is even supposed to sit in the Knesset. And it was a very anticlimactic kind of end for this long Netanyahu reign of 12 years. Just this 71-year-old guy looking for his seat in what was then a very raucous Knesset when they already understood that the vote had passed. There was cheering and applause, obviously, among the new coalition. Most of the people sitting in the gallery were obviously supporters of the new coalition. The people who were about to lose their family members hadn't come, so it wasn't his Knesset anymore. The speaker was a new speaker, someone from an opposing party. And the moment that Netanyahu found the seat of the leader position, also Yair Lapid who the outgoing leader of opposition and incoming foreign minister and alternate prime minister, didn't seem to realize that he was also supposed to vacate his seat, and there were still books and papers, and Netanyahu was already sitting down, and Lapid starting to collect his stuff from the desk there, and get ready to be sworn in as the official number 2 of this new government. And Israel, I mean, Aaron, you know Israel so well. It's not a country for protocol and for ceremony. It does things in its own rather unofficial way, and this was a very sort of low profile. I mean, there was a lot of drama in the situation, but there was no pomp or grandeur to this passing of government. Naftali Bennett, seconds after that, went up, made a very short pledge of loyalty to the state and its laws, and he was Israel's 13th prime minister from that moment. And I think that all of us have spent a lot of time thinking what the end of the Netanyahu era, if this is the end of the Netanyahu era, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, whether it is, what it would look like, what would this final defeat of this almost indestructible prime minister look like? And in the end, it was this very anticlimactic kind of very Israeli kind of moment of the passing of power between Netanyahu and Bennett. And we'll go obviously more deeper into the different questions, but I think the real change here, beyond the personalities, the fact that Netanyahu is now no longer prime minister as we speak for 24 hours, and Naftali Bennett it's not just this exchange of characters, it's just the role of the Israeli prime minister has automatically changed, because in Netanyahu's worldview, he always wanted his role to be a presidential. Israel hasn't got a constitution, but it has enough laws and practice to make an unwritten constitution, and the institutions of the government and the laws that do exist are all geared around a parliamentary system. The prime minister, as in Britain and in other parliamentary systems, is a first among equals. He or she, they're not a president with all the powers of that office as you have in the United States. It's supposed to be a parliamentary position. You are one of 120 Knesset members. You are prime minister because the Knesset has voted confidence in your government, and you are accountable to the Knesset. And Netanyahu has spent most of the last few years, you could argue that from the beginning of his prime ministerial term, he was going towards this. He wanted to concentrate as much power as possible in the office of the prime minister. He even wanted to abolish the presidency and perhaps do a sort of Erdogan kind of merge of the prime minister and the president's role. He certainly marginalized the Knesset as much as he could. He marginalized the civil service. He marginalized his own government. Most of his ministers were there to serve him, not to serve the nation, not to be transport minister or energy minister. And their role was to serve Netanyahu before carrying out the policies of their ministry. And in a split second, the moment Naftali Bennett became prime minister, suddenly the office of the Israeli prime minister returned to its natural proportions. Naftali Bennett certainly is no more than a first among equals. He's the leader of one of the smallest parties now in the Knesset. He didn't even form the government that he's now leading. The government was formed by Yair Lapid. We can list a number of people in the cabinet that Naftali Bennett is supposedly the leader of, who are at least as powerful as he is. Avigdor Lieberman will be controlling Israel's economy. Bennett won't have much of a say there. Benny Gantz will remain actually. The defense minister, Bennett's say will certainly be nothing like Netanyahu's say was. And this is a drastically reduced office. Some would argue that under Bennett, the office of prime minister is now very weak, and that may not be necessarily a good thing for Israel. I think that we can, perhaps this is a necessary change from this all-powerful prime minister that has just departed to a prime minister who reminds us continuously that he's dependent on the Knesset, on the confidence of the Knesset, on this very, very slim majority that the government now has in the Knesset, and on his colleagues in cabinet. More than perhaps any previous prime minister in Israel's history, Naftali Bennett will have to work in a very collegial, almost as equals, perhaps totally as equals, with his ministerial colleagues. And I think that's a good thing. It returns the Israeli system of government back to its proper proportion, to its proper, the balances hopefully will be restored between the different powers. But also, after 12 years of one man running the show, one man appointing everyone, and one man holding the powers, the transition will be a rocky period. We can't really predict what, we can predict some of the challenges which will face Bennett, but the things that will come up in the next days, weeks, and months that are really unpredictable. We don't know what will test him. I'll just end by saying that I think that despite his weakness and the inherent weakness of this government and coalition, that will actually help them stay together, because I think each of the ministers, certainly each of the party leaders, of the 8 party leaders in this government, are aware of how much they are reliant on each other, and they're aware that they'll either sink or swim together. They need every single one of them on the team to work together, and that's a weakness. But I think that they've been through, any Israeli politician has been through a lot in the last 2.5 years with 4 election campaigns. They've been through the Netanyahu years. They do not want to go back to those years, and I think that will be a very strong incentive for this government to stick together, perhaps for longer than is being predicted.
Well, I think it's really instructive. Do you hear me? Are you muting? Okay. Tal, let me turn it over to you now.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. I'll take it from Anshel's story about what was going on in the plenum. I was actually sitting right above Netanyahu and Lapid, was watching Netanyahu and Lapid and Bennett, of course, and was watching them as Bennett and Lapid took the places at the head of the table. It was, quite a moment, 12 years for people who are journalists and are covering prime ministers and ministers, seeing that unfolding in front of my eyes. I thought, this was a moment that we were, thinking might happen, but couldn't really foresee it. 4 election cycles, one after another, and Netanyahu, even though he did not win, he actually sat on that chair for such a long time with interim government and not getting the Knesset, the Knesset trust. So, you know, quite an amazing moment. Right from that event, when they were switching the chairs, they get out of the plenum and they went to hold the first governmental meeting. This is just a ceremonial event, just to say, here we are. We are starting right off with the first meeting. It took place at around 10:30 p.m. Israel time last night. Again, 24 hours ago from now. And I was walking into the room for the government meeting. It's a huge round table. And, you know, before the ministers arrived, I just took a photo with my camera going around the table, you know, taking all the name tags in the sitting in order. And it is not surprising, but very important to note that there is a generational change here. Netanyahu is 72 or almost 72, whereas the prime minister, Bennett, is 49. And the rest of the top of the leaders are between the ages of, you know, 48, 49, 54, 55. One of them, of course, Benny Gantz, is 62, only 10 years younger than Netanyahu. And while going through the names, you know, one probably notice how, you know, most of them are basically offsprings of Netanyahu. They were, I mean, Naftali Bennett was his chief of staff. Ayelet Shaked was his, you know, manager of his chambers. Benny Gantz was the chief of staff of the IDF during, you know, Netanyahu's time. Avigdor Lieberman, the finance minister, was the general director of the Likud and then a minister combined with Netanyahu. Gideon Sa'ar, who is now the justice minister, was the secretary of the government of Netanyahu and then a minister, education and an interior minister with Netanyahu. And I can go on and on. I mean Yair Lapid, who managed the forming of this government, was a minister under Netanyahu. So they all came from his from Netanyahu's academy, if you may want to call it like that. They learned from him some of the tricks. I think many of them, at the last year at least, decided not to take the same political route as he is doing. In very different tones, very different way of handling things. I mean, even Benny Gantz, very naive if you compare him to Netanyahu. So I mean, but Netanyahu is the one who actually recruited some of them and, you know, made them politicians, at least the people who were in the Likud, Bennett, Shaked, and Lieberman, and Gideon Sa'ar. So quite amazing to see this group of people coming into power after so many years working with him, but coming against him. He is the individual. He is alone. We have this, you know, amazing photo from last night when he was, you know, still seated in the prime minister chair, but nobody around him. And he was like staying alone in the plenum while I think one of his colleagues was making a speech. He just stayed there for a couple of minutes and nobody approached him. So it's like the lone leader, as you know, as the image of this group of younger, you know, they are media savvy. Many of them came from the Israeli media. I mean, former, you know, anchor, former, you know, columnist, former, you know, reporter, and they are when they want to, you know, give a contrast, so, you know, form a different government that is going out against the former prime minister, they have to do it together in solidarity. None of them can do it alone. They have to do it as a group. I mean, even Benny Gantz, who was the alternate prime minister, Israel Ramatkal, chief of staff, IDF chief of staff, and I mean, his party brought, you know, 35 seats, unprecedented number for the liberals, left and center of Israel. Even him couldn't do anything by himself. They have to do it as a group. So, and they know it. They are, you know, they are depending on each other. So I don't know about, you know, how long this government will be able to survive, but definitely this government has to be different because they will have to work together or none of them will be able to do anything.
Tal, thank you. it's fascinating to hear you and Anshel, who were actually there, describe this moment. And listening to you, I just get this sense of kind of amazement or wonderment from the two of you about this transition that has taken place. So we now come to Natan. Over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be with you again, but also to be with my two friends. It's a privilege. I'm thinking about what is actually changing, and domestically, what this group hopes, I think, is that it becomes very boring. Yair Lapid, in fact, said that. He hoped that Tal and Anshel have a very boring few years ahead of them after 4 elections in 2 years. It's not going to happen, partly because Benjamin Netanyahu has something to say about it, but that was his hope. And I think that's the mandate of this government. People have mentioned Biden, of course, sometimes, which is the whole idea of, you look at Biden's tweets, for example, they are exceedingly presidential, boring, exactly what you're supposed to say. And it's hard to remember that a mere year ago, what kind of melodrama we had when we just made the mistake of opening our phone. So domestically, they'll be focusing a lot on the economy, and we'll try to do this collectively. They'll have no choice, but exactly as Anshel and Tal said, there'll be very important people who are not Naftali Bennett, and in fact not Yair Lapid. Avigdor Lieberman will be the most important person for many things, but many other issues there will be. There's a minister of education who, and hold your chairs here, is actually a doctor on education. She actually knows something about it. And there are a few people like that who will be in charge, each in their own position. And this goes back to the fundamental idea of parliamentary governance, and in fact, to some tradition in Israel, even when there were very strong prime ministers. On foreign policy, it's interesting. On the one hand, that's not what this government is about. This government is about 2 things, really, I think. One is replacing Benjamin Netanyahu. As you said, that occurred 24 hours ago. And the other is return to normalcy, to having a government. Right now, Israel is operating without a state budget. Every month, the state works with 1/12 of the budget of 2019, not only 2020, 2019, because they didn't pass the budget for 2 years. Why didn't they pass the budget? Because it helped Netanyahu in politics. He managed to go to elections without Benny Gantz becoming prime minister. Never mind. So returning to normalcy, where the very basics, there could be a state budget, where people could be appointed to their jobs, where there be ministers who are simply trying to do their job, hopefully, this would be their main task. Problem is that foreign policy is not going to go away, especially in a country like Israel. So where would it lead? Where might they lead? Well, on Iran, which is probably the most important issue for Israel, on substance, there actually is not that much divergence, not only between Bennett and Netanyahu, but between the whole spectrum of mainstream leaders. Between Lapid and Netanyahu, there's not that much of a difference on substance, at least in the way they present it. So if you ask them about JCPOA, whatever they said at the time, now they say it's a bad deal. By the way, they should. That's Israel's position. There are enough doves in the world. Israel has to be the hawk here, right? But there is a very big difference between whether they go to political combat with Biden over a return to compliance with the JCPOA, like Bibi did in 2015 against Obama, or they don't. Bibi mentioned this in his speech yesterday, and he said, I would do it again, and they'll not be able to do it. And indeed, the first signals, including from Bennett, are that he might take the approach of Gantz and Lapid, which is to say, we might object, we have very strong reservations, but we will do so among allies with the United States and try to see what we can get from America without breaking the scene. That's very crucial. The second issue, of course, is the Palestinian affair, the whole Israeli-Palestinian issue. There, the Bennett-Lapid government and the Biden administration have a shared desire, I think, which is to see that issue go to sleep for about 4 years. And that desire is not going to happen. We saw that last month. This government in Israel agrees on exactly nothing with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have Meretz on the left, we have Ram as well, and then we have Naftali Bennett actually heading the government. They agree on nothing. And so therefore, there will be no major moves, and Bennett and Yair Lapid each have a veto on all major decisions, so they can veto each other out of any major decisions, and they've made clear, Bennett has made clear, no annexation, but also no disengagement from any more territory, no major moves. However, you will have small things, quote unquote, small things happening. The status quo, which is not static, will continue. The blurring of the green line, the events in Jerusalem, we're going to have tomorrow, in fact, another march. All these things, some of them are just bureaucratic, not even decisions by the cabinet. They will continue and they can blow up in everyone's face. And finally, with the US, how will they try to deal? Well, here it's worth listening to Yair Lapid, who will be very important in foreign affairs. He's going to be a dominant foreign minister who actually wants to be foreign minister. That's sort of also a novelty. And he will try to rebuild the foreign ministry, although Gabi Ashkenazi has already been doing that, I should say. And Lapid has been speaking publicly, including now as foreign minister, about the need for bipartisanship and the desire to speak to Democrats, not just Republicans. This is not only a dig at the senator from Jerusalem from the Republican Party, Benjamin Netanyahu. It's also a genuine belief that Israel, with a partisan, becoming such a partisan issue as it is today already, it's not a future tense, it's today, is terrible for Israel, and therefore it's in Israel's interest to invest in one of the two parties in the United States. That's something that Lapid will try to do. I'll note that Naftali Bennett, the right-winger, not only said similar things in his speech in the Knesset, he in fact turned to English to say bipartisan, and I'm sure he was not only speaking to Israelis when he did that.
Yeah.
And I'll end there by just saying the Biden administration would also like a fresh start for two reasons. One, it's not Bibi, and this is going to shock everyone. They don't like Bibi. And secondly, because they do see the possibility for a fresh start with Bennett, not on any peace deal. That's not happening. He's not becoming a two-stater. You can put that aside. But on practical steps, he likes to present himself as an entrepreneur, think outside the box, can-do guy. He's a multimillionaire from tech. And on that, they may try to engage him, even on the Palestinian issue, but only on things below the high level, two states, one state, etc.
Natan, thanks. Very good news for Mr. Biden. I mean, the three issues that you've identified, no change in substance, but a huge change in process. No courting evangelicals, no courting the Republicans, no trying to play one party against the other. That's going to end. Palestinians, maybe some of Israeli steps in and around Jerusalem will be frozen. You have a minister of, it's not the minister of Interior, it was the minister of Public Security.
Internal security.
Omer Bar-Lev, who is Chaim Bar-Lev's son, that's correct? Seems like a guy who's, you know, not prone to immoderate or illiberal moves, and certainly on partisan politics here. This will make it easier for the Biden administration to navigate the line they're navigating between a Republican Party that wants to make everyone believe they are the go-to party, and an increasingly divided Democratic Party that is pushing the administration to do more in the Palestinian issue. This should be good news for Biden. Okay, annoying questions from me. I want to move forward, but I do have one question that I want to ask the three of you. Try to keep your answers brief. I've sort of mulled this over in my own mind, and I can't come up with an answer that satisfies me. So here's my question for the three of you. You can pick one or the other, or you could do both, but brief answers. What, in your judgment, it's a question about the past, is Benjamin Netanyahu's greatest legacy for good on one hand and for ill on the other? Tal, can I start with you? I think you need to unmute. Tal, there you go.
Yeah, thank you. Obviously, I think greatest legacy happened in his, last year with the agreements with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Actually, some of them were, negotiating and having like a great relationship with Israel. But not on the world stage. It was like a hidden relationship. I mean, Morocco, everybody here can travel to Morocco for so many years, but we did not have an embassy and we did not have, open air relationship. The same, with United Arab Emirates, we couldn't even travel, and Bahrain, we couldn't even travel, and now it's open. I think that was a great, great news for the state of Israel, for the economy, for diplomacy. Netanyahu actually claimed for many years, he claimed that he can bring that without moving even a tiny step towards the Palestinians, and nobody really thought that he can actually pull it, and he did. So it was both surprising and heartwarming, specifically in a very difficult year of the COVID. And specifically in a year where, the atmosphere, the mood of after so many elections, it was after the third election, So that was, great move. No downside really.
Right.
And the other question was about his, where,
What was the worst thing he did? Right. Worst thing he did.
Yeah. I think the worst thing he did was inciting against the Arab citizens of Israel. He was also inciting against, liberals and lefty, naming them and so on. But I think the worst part of it was going so bluntly and strong against a minority, our citizens, people that live here with us and should and need to have equal rights and equal opportunities. Even though Netanyahu claimed for the years that he gave more budget and so on, the fact of life was that the situation in the Arab communities deteriorated badly with crime, neglection, infrastructure, and obviously on the top of everything was the incitement during the campaigns. Even on the fourth campaign, he actually tried to present himself as someone who is working with the Arabs, but really for the first and second campaign, blaming all the Israeli Arabs to be doing fraud in the polls and so on. That was horrific and very bad, service for the very delicate democracy that we have here.
Thanks. Anshel, you wrote the book. So for good or ill?
Well, my high and low points of Netanyahu are very much the same as Tal's. I'll just, I think, slightly zoom out. Tal mentioned the agreements last year with the 4 Arab regimes. I understand that nowadays you're not allowed to call them in DC anymore the Abraham Accords, but that's what they were called at the time. I think Netanyahu's legacy here is much, much deeper than just these 4 agreements. His legacy is having reversed the paradigm, and someone like yourself, Aaron, who's so involved in Middle East diplomacy for so many years, it was always the inside out. First of all, Israel needs to reach a solution with the Palestinians to end the occupation, to enable Palestinian state, and only then it can reach better relations, not just with the Arab world, but with the entire world. Israel will. The idea was Israel will not have prosperity, will not have a Western style of living, will not enjoy normal or good relations with most of the world if it doesn't solve the Palestinian issue. And the opposite, if it doesn't solve the Palestinian issue, as Ehud Barak said, there'll be a diplomatic tsunami, and Ariel Sharon, it'll be like Israel will be taken like the bull in the bull ring to the corral to be slaughtered at the end. It was all. I mean, that was the equation, that was the paradigm that everybody had, including in Israel, and even some of the right wings. I mentioned Ariel Sharon, and Netanyahu reversed that. Now, some people are not happy with the fact that he's done that he's proven that Israel does not need to have a solution with the Palestinians to enjoy GDP on a level with most Western European countries and great relations with many countries around the world, including with a number of Arab regimes. But I think that anybody who proves, who shows you what reality is, that's a legacy. That is the truth. And Netanyahu did not create that. He just proved that that the diplomatic orthodoxies of so many of 20 or 30 years going back, certainly to the beginning of the Oslo process, were wrong. And we have to accept the world as it is, and that is the world. We may not like that world, but Netanyahu showed us what this world really looks like. That is a legacy, and as Natan said before, this new government will want to stick to that status quo in which let's not make any movement on the Palestinian issue and let's focus on other things. That is certainly his. I don't want to call it a positive legacy because the Palestinian problem still needs to be solved. There's a massive injustice there, but that is something that he's done that we can point to as a high point and what his biggest achievement. I think his lowest point, and I totally agree with what Tal was saying about how Netanyahu has been speaking for so many years about Israel's Arab or Palestinian citizens, call them what you will. I think it's an even wider thing than that. Netanyahu's low point is how he's allowed 2 major communities in Israel, one who were his partners, the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, the other one who he used to incite against the Arabs, but he treated them both as autonomies, as parts, as separate parts from Israeli society, to be used for his political benefit, but not to be part of Israeli society or Israeli mainstream. And there's a quote from Netanyahu in which he's talking about various socio-economic and macroeconomic indices, and he says, okay, if we put the Haredim and Arabs aside, we're doing great. And this has been Netanyahu's way of dealing with Israeli society. There are and nowadays Haredim and Arab Israelis are about a third of Israeli population and growing if you're looking at demographic trends. And that, first of all, it's extremely cynical what he's done there, whether to incite against or to smother with political power and money, but not to bring in, not to say, okay, but you've got to be part of the workforce, you've got to be part of national service, etc., etc. He's allowed these two parts of the population to be in increasing isolation, and I think in the long term that was it's causing huge damage to Israeli society. I hope this new government, with its different attitudes towards both communities, will start to reverse those very damaging trends.
It's a profound, both those judgments, Tal and yours, Anshel, is profound given what percentage these communities comprise of the modern state of Israel. Natan.
Yeah, I mean, I join very much what the others said, so I'll try not to repeat that and say that, yesterday in his speech, he tried in the Knesset when he was losing already, he tried to give a bit of a legacy speech. And he's often commented that his legacy will be that he kept Israel safe, that on his watch, Israel was not destroyed by Iran. But he also mentioned yesterday, and it's not a new theme, and it happens to be correct, which is that the past decade has seen fewer Israeli deaths than any other decade since the foundation of the state. For a country that knows so much about bereavement, this is a huge thing. And it does owe something to his policy. I'm not a Netanyahu fan, but there is no question that he has been very cautious with the use of force above a certain level. He has used it to a degree, but above a certain level he has not. He has been much less warlike than most of his predecessors. And in that sense, he has allowed Israel to enjoy not big P peace, but small P peace of just less death. That's on the good side, and it's a major thing. It's part of the reason he's so popular. The second is the flip side, which is his sort of sometimes cautious, we shouldn't overstate it, it's not just cautious, but his sometimes cautious approach has also allowed deep undercurrents to be extremely damaging, almost pernicious in the long term. One, Anshel just touched upon, real extremely important deep structural issues in Israeli society that from abroad can seem small, but they're not, they're huge. And the second is on the Palestinian issue. He's tried to freeze the situation while dealing with the UAE, but the situation is not frozen. Things are happening. The reality on the ground is very different than it was 12 years ago when he took office. And that will have an effect on the degree of freedom, the opportunity, the availability of options for any successor he has. And in that sense, I think he's betrayed even his own conservative approach, which would try to maintain options open, would try to be cautious on that. And there I think he's been almost reckless by neglect of undercurrents, bureaucratic inertia, things that happen below the cabinet level.
It's a risk aversion when it comes to reckless and dangerous military adventures, which is positive, and it's a risk aversion when it comes to dealing with the Palestinian issue, which is fundamentally negative. Okay, one more question. It's not about the future, but it pertains very much to past. It pertains very much to the future. Netanyahu is not going home to any Israeli Mar-a-Lago or Bedminster. He probably will remain the most skilled and effective politician in the country, this time in opposition. So, and I don't have a good feel for this. What is it that he could actually do to cause stresses? Whether he could bring the government down from the outside is arguable, but what could he do that would make it harder for Bennett and Lapid and the others to cohere?
Aaron.
Wow, for you.
Well, I just want to go down memory lane and remind everybody that Netanyahu was an opposition leader when Prime Minister Rabin was prime minister. And when you ask what could he do, I mean, I lived to witness that. I was in Rabin Square. It was called back then. It was Kikar Malchei Israel. It had another name. He was, he's still considered to be the person, one of the people who incited against the prime minister. He was the opposition leader back then. So I won't be surprised if we will see huge demonstration. We already seen huge demonstration in the last 2 weeks, and death threats against, members of the Israeli parliament who were trying to form a coalition under the law. And he was well known for not stopping any of it, not calling his people to calm down and so on. So, I mean, it's a really, I don't want to go that in that direction, but it's not ancient history here.
Well, when the head of Shin Bet issues a public warning that incitement words could have consequences, it's a serious problem. And thank you for reminding all of us, Tal. Anshel, a thought on Bibi in opposition?
Tal mentioned Netanyahu's first stint as leader of the opposition. Now, in all of Israeli political history, only 6 leaders of opposition have become afterwards prime minister, have made it from opposition to the prime minister's office. The only one who's done it twice is Netanyahu. He did it both in '96 and again in 2009. Right. So he's not just the longest serving prime minister in Israel, he's also the most successful leader of opposition in the sense of having made that transition that every leader of opposition wants to make. So certainly do not count out Netanyahu trying to do it a third time. I mean, he is trying now to do it a third time. His chances of success are certainly not low. And I, however, think that, I mean, yes, you're right. The fact that the Shin Bet chief made that warning last week means that there is a level of danger of that the words and the protests will veer into violence. But that said, the number of people actually turning out for Netanyahu on the streets in the last few weeks, in these very angry protests outside the houses of various right-wingers who are part of this new government, outside Naftali Bennett's house, Ayelet Shaked, and others, was actually quite small. I think the biggest of these demonstrations, which was outside the house of Nir Orbach, who at one point was seen as the weakest link, I think the most they got there was 400 people. It's not a mass movement. Yes, Netanyahu is a very popular politician. He has a strong and wide base, but this movement of people who are really going to go out, as they did against Oslo back in the 1990s, I think is a very small movement because there isn't a real issue here beyond Netanyahu himself, and there aren't really that many Netanyahu fanatics who are going to put down their lives or are going to try and take someone's life just somehow to help Netanyahu. So I think that let's keep this in proportion. We haven't had a January 6th moment here in Israel. Lots of reasons that you can, lots of differences between the US and Israel. But Netanyahu is no longer in this all-powerful situation where he was. The Netanyahu camp, such as it was, is much diminished now because you have 3 right-wing parties in this government, all led by his former followers. You've got Gideon Saar's party, Naftali Bennett's party, Avigdor Lieberman's party. They're all staunch right-wingers who have abandoned him. You're beginning to see the fraying of this of the ultra-orthodox Likud rock-solid alliance Netanyahu built. He's and at the end of the day, he is 70, almost 72. He's still very energetic. For the next few months, he'll be a very combative leader of the opposition. I wonder whether in 4 or 5 months, if this government gets through its first stage, and the most important stage will be passing their first budget, if they get through that in the next few months, will Netanyahu want to stay a Knesset member when that means that he can't go abroad, be invited by his rich friends, do 6-figure speaking gigs, sign a whatever 7 or 8 figure book deal that he hopes to sign with some big American publisher? he can't do those things as a Knesset member. So he can't remain leader of the opposition and have the kind of lifestyle that he wants to have. I will not be surprised if he'll resign from the Knesset sometime in the fall. He'll probably find a way to remain leader of Likud, but as I wrote in a piece the other day, he'll be the king in exile.
Right.
Could be wrong, but I think that temptation is going to be very, very strong if this government doesn't, if this government survives for another few months.
Right. We haven't talked about Netanyahu's trial. That's a whole nother rabbit hole. But I think if I've got my dates right, Ehud Olmert was indicted in 2008 and didn't begin to serve his sentence until 2016. So I guess it's conceivable that this trial will drag on for quite a while. I want to turn to Lapid and Bennett. Enough Netanyahu. Natan, you wrote in your piece this morning that you had obviously had a conversation with Yair Lapid, and he's the unsung or the sung hero of this enterprise. His selflessness, his maturity, his judgment, all of this has risen. His stock is rising. What can you just, in 2 or 3 points, what do we need to know about Yair Lapid? And then I'm going to ask Tal the question about Naftali Bennett, the same. What do we need to know about Yair Lapid?
Well, Yair Lapid comes from the profession of my colleagues here. He's a journalist, was a very well-known one, very eloquent speaker, eloquent writer too. He wrote for what was then the widest publication, and he was a TV presenter, and a good TV presenter. He's appeared in movies, and he's written popular songs. So he comes from a mythical northern Tel Aviv, which also happens to be a physical northern Tel Aviv, but from the mythical northern Tel Aviv, so upper middle class. He's the son of a former minister, Tomi Lapid. Tomi Lapid was the firebrand secularist of Israel, so the anti-ultra-Orthodox, and he probably would not have even minded being called anti-ultra-Orthodox. That Yair Lapid would not say. But what is really striking is how he described him and his success now, his selflessness, his maturity, his calm. I want to be kind, but these are not the words at all that people would use to describe Yair Lapid just 2 or 3 years ago. He was known as arrogant, as full of ego, would never step aside. And the last 2 years have been remarkable. He's been extremely disciplined. He set aside his ego and let Benny Gantz lead the party and then cancel rotation between them. Now he has formed a whole government and simply handed the prime ministership to Naftali Bennett, knowing that that's the one way he can pull Bennett away from the Bibi camp. So we have someone here who is calculated, is smart, is very disciplined in message, and that has been true for a long time. His campaigning has always been good. He has a limit, or he seemed at least to have a limit on his base, given his background, sort of upper middle class. That's always been his problem. And he has now managed to reach beyond it through leadership. And for the first time in a long time, I know people from across the center and the left who speak very, admiring is maybe too strong, but appreciatively of his leadership. It's important to know that his appeal, sort of what I was mentioning before, his desire to speak to Democrats, it's not just utilitarian. It's not just instrumental. This is his natural milieu. If he were American, if Bibi were American, he would be Ron Dermer. He'd be hardcore Republican. No chance. It's not by chance that they get along with them.
I must say, Madeleine Albright once described him as the Israeli Newt Gingrich.
Quite possibly, and both very smart. Gingrich is, of course, brilliant, and so is Netanyahu. It's not mince words, brilliant. Yair Lapid would fit in with a Biden sort of party, not an AOC sort of party. He's not a lefty. Let's be clear. He's a fan of Maccabi Tel Aviv, not Hapoel Tel Aviv. So that Hapoel is the worker. That's the red group of the old left lead guard. He is the rival team. So he comes from his family from what used to be moderate, right-wing, liberal kind of world. So it's liberal in the European sense, not in the American one. He means what he says about moderation and dealing, in secular terms and liberal terms. But if perhaps for political positioning and perhaps also for genuine belief on many issues, he is at least centrist and sometimes can sound hawkish. Partly because he judges that the Israeli public is quite hawkish in the past couple of decades, and so he needs to sound that way. But his opening positions are not Meretz, they're not labor, they're not the dream of most Democrats. That's not what it is. He is will consider himself a patriot, maybe nationalist. In fact, yes, moderate one. I'll add one more point. He made an interesting comment, true or not, I don't know, but he said if he had all the power in the world, he would still form this coalition. I'm guessing he would head it, but he would still want a coalition that included everyone. His centrism, he often frames in ideological terms. Meaning we have to come together, we have to lower the tones. It's not just a political position, it's also an ideological one. That's part of what drives leftists up the wall when they hear him speak. It's like, well, just say what you mean already. But that's kind of the type of guy he is. He's going to be a good foreign minister for two reasons. He wants to, and it's his natural thing. He got to politics as a speaker, as a presenter, as a writer. That's how he got there. And so foreign minister fits.
Okay, Tom, I've probably met it once. He seemed affable and willing to talk. His image here is of a right-wing ideologue, often described to the right of Benjamin Netanyahu. But dig a little deeper. What's beneath the surface?
Okay, so, it's the first time we have a prime minister who is, wears a yarmulke, a religious believer. I mean, all of the prime minister before that was, secular, and Naftali Bennett is actually practicing Jew. He is, I would call it a modern Orthodox. I think Anshel said earlier, he is the T-light, like not too religious, but I would think, the more correct, term would be, in Americans, terms, would be a modern Orthodox. So he is adhering, to Shabbat and to all religious ceremonies, but obviously he's not the one to coerce or demand from others. And every prime minister in Israel adheres to Shabbat laws because of respect to the Jewish state. I think, Bennett grew up in Sayeret Matkal. It's the most, I think we call it Reconquist unit. It's the most prominent military special forces, maybe, the same team that killed Osama bin Laden or so. So he grew up in, military thinking of how to solve problems out of the box. This is his kind of a logo, or his, his title. He wants to be perceived as the one who thinks out of the box. It came around in two major instances in the last couple of years. During Tzuk Eitan, the war we had in 2014, he proclaimed to be the one who, started to dealing with the tunnels. In the recent COVID, in the COVID, he was the defense minister, and he demanded from Netanyahu to be more proactive, and he was actually, being himself more proactive until he was fired from the government by Netanyahu. He is, the thinker of the annexation here in Israel. I mean, people in the right wing always talked about annexation, but, they never actually ran on a platform that suggested annexation. He promoted since 2012 annexation of the entire sea area. If one recalls, it's the area where you don't have the cities and the surrounding suburbs of Palestinian cities. So that's about between 60 to 70% of the future Palestinian, so-called Palestinian state, something that we don't actually, I don't think anybody here believes it will ever happen. But he was suggesting actually to annex the area and give citizenship to about 150 plus Palestinians. So that was his idea, and Netanyahu actually was, embracing it later on, and not really the entire plan, but embracing some of it. So he's going to be he is already a prime minister thinking about annexation without being able to promote it in any way. So when you talk about his ideology, I think maybe you should add also how pragmatic he is, because obviously he entered this government knowing, he wrote that about 2 weeks before the government was formed. There isn't going to be any annexation at all. There isn't going to be any, movement in that direction. but there's not going to be any, two-state solution. It's not the option as well. So I would say very proactive type, but we also have to be very careful about his eagerness to prove himself, and about his maybe, how would you say, paziz, not too cautious. I can remember the word for paziz. Maybe Anshel can help me here. A person who is,
reckless.
Tending to, he may be reckless. So we need to be very careful watching him. What path does he choose?
Thank you. Anshel, I have one question for you, and then we're going to wrap up. I have a yes or no question for the three of you, which you must answer. But you wrote a long piece on Naftali Bennett in Haaretz, English. Yeah, I think you made the point that he's 49 years old. He's done a lot of things. And I think you extrapolated that he's representative of, use the term Israel 3.0, that he's a person in a hurry. And somehow that kind of reflects on what his own aspirations are. Can a guy who controls 6 seats and seems to have crossed the entire right wing in Israel actually not only become a prime minister, but have a political future? What is his base?
Well, he doesn't really have a base now. He's sort of carved out these niches of not of rather small spaces that Netanyahu has left him, and every time he carved out a space, Netanyahu, tried to take away whatever base he had, and we call this, in every Israeli election, how Netanyahu comes with a drinking straw and sucks up, potential Bennett voters and brings them back to Likud. Naftali Bennett does not have a base because he's a nationalist, but there is only really one big nationalist party in Israel, that's Likud. That may change in the future, but it hasn't changed until now. And look, in 2 years and 2 months, if this government survives, Naftali Bennett has to make way. Lapid will become prime minister, and not only will he not replace Lapid as foreign minister, but through a whole reshuffle, he'll become the interior minister, which is a rather boring ministry which deals mainly with local government. I somehow don't see Naftali Bennett moving from the prime minister's seat, where all the exciting things we'll be dealing with, to suddenly starting to deal with the budget for a local council in Negev or something like that. And I don't think Naftali Bennett is thinking that right now. He's very focused on what he has to do. It's such a hectic and absorbing job being the Israeli prime minister. But I get the feeling Naftali Bennett won't be like the man he's replacing, Benjamin Netanyahu, staying for 30 odd years in Israeli politics and basically never being able to retire. I totally see Naftali Bennett as someone who will see that the fact that he's served for 2 years or so as Israeli prime minister, if he does a decent job, if he'll really be the person who replaced Netanyahu, which in itself was a big achievement. I totally see Netanyahu in his early 50s, a few years from now, embarking on a new career. I don't think that he has. I think he very much wanted to be prime minister, but I don't think he necessarily wants to remain prime minister his whole life like Netanyahu does. And that's a great thing. It's so much healthier to have people come into politics and not see it as something that they're going to... okay, Joe Biden has been for 40 years in politics, and I think that has made him a good politician. And there is a case to be made for, lifelong, career-long politician. But there's also a case to be made for people who come into politics, spend a certain time there, and then pursue another career. I think that Bennett will prove to be of the second kind.
Got it. Okay, one final question. Yes or no? No explanation, but you must answer. Well, I can't force you to answer. Next June 2022, will Carnegie be hosting another session with the three of you in an effort to assess the 1 year mark for the Change Coalition? Yes or no? Natan, neighbors, at least Carnegie and Brookings. So
yeah.
What is your answer? Yes or no? Carnegie hosting the 1-year assessment of this government. Come on, Natan, you can do it. You can say it.
I think so, but maybe Brookings will host.
Okay. I'll take that as a yes. Anshel, yes or no?
We just published a piece on the Haaretz.com website in which I write that I think this government actually has the makings to survive longer than people expect. But I expect whether Kings or Carnegie, the next one will be, you'll at least fly us over, so we can do this, longer.
Right, exactly. Yeah, we'll be on COVID at that time. But I'm glad. So I'll put you down in the decided category. So we have two yeses.
I said yes. I said yes.
You said yes. Yeah, yes. Not undecided. Decided yes. Okay, Tal.
Yes, because as long as they pass the budget, the answer is yes. And if the budget probably should be in the next couple of months, and it shouldn't be a problem because they're still sticking together, then you can have us also in December of 2022, and it still probably would be a yes.
Wonderful. Listen, and let me thank the three of you. It was fantastic. Your authority and expertise is phenomenal, and both on a conceptual and a granular level. And I want to thank you for participating, and thank everybody for listening. Until another session of Carnegie Connects.
Thank you.
Take care. Stay healthy.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.